Thank you, Tom and Richard, for the invitation to speak. And before I start, I want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land and pay my respects to elders past and present. So I'm going to sort of take a different tack. I've been invited to basically speak about how have we thought about a programmatic response to this issue, of the issue that both Tom and Deb raised around the youth transition. And so to give you a lens around how we think of the kind of institutional architecture and the various roles of government, not-for-profit and community in designing a response to young people, and particularly in our case, young people who experience disadvantage in place. So that's what I'm going to take up. There's sort of three parts to the talk, so lest you think I'm never going to get to the case study, I am getting to the case study. But I just wanted to give you a sense of the way that we go about thinking and planning for a kind of the intervention that we're talking about, because I think some of this methodological stuff is important. It's important about thinking how we with government think about the development of interventions in place that might affect the trajectories of young people and or other cohorts. So the question is how to build social mobility for young people through a people and place focused intervention. And if you haven't seen it, there's a great report done by AFES several years ago that really articulates a framework for thinking about place-focused interventions, which we've found quite useful. So today I've been asked to provide a case study of our Transition to Work service, which is a federally funded program for disadvantaged young people transitioning from education to employment, and it includes particularly early school leavers, people who are disconnected from family support, and they're service connected, what we term service connected people. So they might be in the justice system, the mental health system, the out-of-home care system, the homelessness system, or a combination of those. So we're quite interested in that group of young people. And I have to say, I put a caveat on the actual program I'm going to talk about because it's informed by an evidence base, but as those in the space would know, it's a fledgling evidence base. We've looked to the OECD, we've looked to some work done by the Melbourne Institute with Guillaume Kelb and others around an evidence base for best practice for this kind of youth transitions approach. And we've also looked to our own evidence, which we've been doing through a range of means, including developmental evaluations, of which I'm leading a developmental evaluation of this particular program. So what's the problem? So we talk about a fit-for-purpose policy and service response, and we think that it requires clarity, real clarity about the problem to be addressed. And I'll say something about this in a second. So how do we understand the issue of youth unemployment or the stalled transition for particularly highly disadvantaged young people? The way we like to think about that in designing a response is that we think it's a multi-level problem requiring a multi-level solution. And a multi-sectoral solution. So we talk about the multiplier effects in these things. It's not sufficient to just think about one aspect of the problem. So we think our program's intentionally designed to address the individual level problem of the stalled youth transition, so by building human and social capital. But we're beginning to see, along with the evidence base, that human capital alone is not going to be all of the answer, and particularly for the most disadvantaged young people in assisting them to make those transitions. But importantly, and based on our assessment of the nature of the multi-level problem, these young people are confronting, it's a problem in the labour market, it's a problem around technology and automation, it's a problem around conditional social security, etc. So we're reaching in this program for more structural social level change that is bigger than the program itself. I say reaching. We're reaching. We haven't arrived there yet. So if you can take that in the spirit of we're playing with a set of ideas to try and affect something more complex than an individual level response to that stalled youth transition. So what's the ambition? we've got a big ambition, and it's part of a suite of work that we're doing with young people, and we have a sort of broadly similar ambition around this suite of work that we're doing, which is to change that is government, services, the community, think about young people and their employment challenges. And what I would like to say about that, and I'll say a bit more as I get on, but just here is to say we're trying to get a shift from a disadvantaged, disengaged, disconnected interpretation of these young people to a reconception of them as able, talented, but lacking in the opportunities, resources and networks that might assist them to realise that ability. Where we are also wanting to develop programs, networks and real jobs to expand the opportunities. And we want to mobilise shared responsibility in the community. What I often see in this space is we talk about, what's government's role? And I think government's role is quite limited. It's obviously important, but it's limited. There are other players that have to play in this space to affect the kind of change that we want to see. And it's working out what is the expertise and capacity of those players to do their bit for young people. And we want to create relationships in place that can affect social change. So a multi-level problem around youth unemployment, the stalled transition, a multi-level solution is required. And so we're trying to work at both a local and a national level to effect reform. And we're looking at both individual level factors and structural level factors. Now, our capacity to work and do much in each of these is limited, but this is the ambition, this is where we see some of the solution lying. And then in delivering it, we're always grappling with the issue of fidelity of a model versus how to adapt it in place for people in place. And so that becomes a challenge, particularly in the developmental evaluation space and the evidence forming space, where we're looking for a kind of methodological ways of resolving this issue, this balance between fidelity and flexibility. And we're very interested, there's been a lot of discussion about data, I'm sure we'll get into it later, but we're very interested in complementing this push towards big data with thick data, with different sorts of data, because what we see is there's a wholesale lack of really fine-grained data about what the lives and experiences of people in place is, and there's a wholesale lack of data around what do we learn through the implementation processes of programs. We've not had an investment in evaluation typically per se, but especially in developmental evaluation, where you can learn in real time what's working and not working and then adjust to improve the outcomes. So I just want to say something very quick about our approach. We've been very influenced by Carol Backey, who's a social policy analyst. And I'll just say this, we're always asking, what's the problem represented to be here? And we ask it as we go in the program development, because we want to check ourselves, are we capturing all that we need to, or are we captured by a set of framing ideas in relation to the program or the policy that are going to limit our capacity to adapt a solution for young people? So what's the problem represented to be? And she's got a list of 13 questions which are like gold for people trying to design programs and policy. And this idea, I've left the slide out, this idea of a multifocal lens. And why do I say this? So we want to look, we like this image of the multifocal lens. You know, when you put on your multifocals, if you wear them, that they've got, what they have is this capacity for a seamless transition between the short, medium and longer term vision. And we think that in the design of programmatic policy solutions for these sorts of issues, that the designers and the co-designers need to hold in place what do we need to do in the short term, what should we strive for in the medium and long term. And I guess the thing that we have sometimes, that government sometimes doesn't have, particularly at this point in time in our polity, which is that we stay in place as not-for-profits for a long period of time, whereas there will be changeover of governments, of bureaucrats, etc. We actually hold relationships in place over a long period of time. Therefore, it is beholden on us to take a multifocal perspective and hold this short, medium and longer term ambition in program design. So then just a few things about some guiding theoretical assumptions, and obviously I'm not going to have time to really go into that today. One of the things that people who will have heard me speak before will have heard me speak about capabilities. We've been very influenced by Sen and Nussbaum, and more recently by a theorist called Paul James from the University of Western Sydney, that basically makes this claim, and that governments, both Commonwealth and state, have taken up Sen and Nussbaum's work in earlier iterations. But we've been interested in this idea of how do you build capability, and what are the conditions, the enabling conditions, the opportunities, the resources and networks that build capability such that disadvantaged people of any age can make that transition or into a out of disadvantage. And where we've taken up Paul James's kind of take on this capabilities approach is he emphasises that it's not just individual capability that we need to pay attention to. We must pay attention to other actors and institutions in the domain. So in this instance, service provider capability and community capability, which will include employers. And we think that the obvious thing in this is an idea around place, and Ruth Finch's in the room, and we've been very indebted to Ruth Finch's work, human geographer, around thinking about place. And I can't do justice to Ruth's work here, but Ruth makes the point that a lot of policy to date has been really public policy and economic policy, etc., has been focused around place as a site and place as a container. And she's urging us to shift towards also including an understanding of place as a place of relationship, of encounter, and that if you don't understand that, then you're not going to be able to effectively work with people in place to assist them to change their lives and make a difference. Just a little bit about place as container. The places container is kind of reflected in Vincent's work, where you see these postcodes of disadvantage. And it gives rise to sort of people-focused solutions in place at the individual household and community level. And it's typically driven through economic and social policy, whereas places, sites of locational disadvantage gives rise to an emphasis on infrastructure, more buildings. And if I had time, I'd love to do this beautiful story of the history of Broadmeadows, where we do actually implement this project, because what you see in that is the impact over a 40, 50-year period of these two sorts of ideas. First, places containers, so lots of individual family level interventions in Broadmeadows in the 40s and 50s, and then places as sites. They didn't put the infrastructure in, even though it was intended. It came much later. But what was missed in it was this idea as places of encounter, where you look at the relationships that produce and reproduce equity of opportunity, etc., as well as inclusion and exclusion. And then the other thing that we think is really key in thinking about the design of these sorts of programs is that we need to think of the whole of community. And this is my earlier point, that it's government has a role, it has particular expertise and particular capacities, but so too do the community sector agencies, the educational institutions, and the other community institutions and citizens themselves. And so the design of these sorts of responses need to take account of that and need to be really intentional about how to leverage people's roles and capacities. So I'm now at that long preamble, but it will show you the kind of thinking that's informed the design of this particular thing. So what's transition to work? It's a federally funded national service funded by the Department of Employment, and it's delivered in 51 employment regions across Australia. and it provides young people with intensive pre-employment services to increase their work readiness and move them into employment. And I'll just say a little bit about the genesis of it. So in 2014, you remember that horror budget, the Abbott and Costello budget of 2014, which was highly punitive and coincided at the time with really high rates of youth unemployment, and particularly in certain areas. And there was a lot of mutterings and murmurings across the country in electorates by backbenchers who were being petitioned by their constituents about the rising rates of unemployment, which was beginning to bite into the middle classes as well as into the disadvantaged. At this point in time, the Brotherhood, as many of you who come from Victoria would know in particular, we've had a long-term investment in thinking about employment and done a lot of research on it in the past, different sorts of programs, etc. And so we began a campaign to really draw attention to the impact of youth unemployment. And we were, the campaign included data that we put out in the Youth Unemployment Monitor. It also included strategic targeting of backbenchers because we really wanted to raise this issue of what does it mean for young people in place around their access to employment. At the same time, we started talking to government about an evidence-informed model that we've been trialling in our services, funding ourselves, that might be a way of addressing some of these employment issues. And this coincided with the loss of a program called Youth Connections. And there was a lot of lobbying by an alliance of youth connections providers saying that for the first time in 20 years we would have no program to deal with young people who are highly disadvantaged transitioning from school and early school leaving to some form of work. The consequences of this were that we put forward an idea to the Department of Employment about some of the what we thought would be the enabling conditions in a model for a new employment program. And a combination of factors, some we know, some we don't know. There was a major investment, $300 million for this transition to work program, with some elements that we'd said that we felt that were really important. So the tender specs came out, and we were very interested in how might we take to scale and test an evidence-informed model around this transition to work program. And we have another broader agenda at the Brotherhood around how we might enable smaller community-embedded organisations to remain in place and not be consumed by larger BSL type and larger not-for-profits, because we have a notion that those smaller organisations have deep connections into their communities, deep histories, and they leverage deep goodwill, social capital, etc. And so on the back of those sorts of ideas, we convened a group of the former Youth Connections providers and asked them to come to Melbourne to see whether they would be interested in forming a community of practice to develop and scale a model of program delivery. Well, I think 18 or 19 put their hands up for it. We said that they would have to tender in their own right. So I'm saying this sort of detail because it goes to the commissioning of these sorts of services, which is the point I'm going to get to later in the talk, to tender in their own right, but that we would support them in the tender process to actually put it in, and they joined small groups to write of agencies to write the tender all across the country. So 11 of those agencies across the country, were all in every state and territory, got up, including the Brotherhood ones, which was an immense relief because it would have been extremely embarrassing if we hadn't have got up. But we did in Frankston and in Broadmeadows. And we really feel like in these sorts of initiatives, We want a small amount of skin in the game so that we understand the experience of delivery, but we don't. Our ambition is not in actually having a big service footprint in these areas. And we came together around a shared mission to share ideas and expertise with an evidence and effective model to break down competition between the providers, which has been an outcome of the increased marketisation of the system, and as has aggregation of services and mergers, etc. And so we were really trying to get past that and to demonstrate the value of collaboration and co-production in responding to complex problems. Because we saw this as a multi-level problem with a multi-level solution required, we knew that a number of partners needed to be at the table, the not-for-profits, but also government. And we conceived of ourselves as an enabling organisation, which is something that we've written about extensively as we've written more and more about commissioning. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. So the model, I'm not going to talk too much about the actual program model because I just want to talk about some of its ambition. But the model is based on these ideas around capabilities, which when we talk about it locally, we talk about it using advantage thinking, and we talk about this idea of harnessing the community effort. We think that's a bad term, but we can't come up with anything better, which is how do you mobilise people in community, citizens, government, business, not-for-profits, civil society more broadly. And it's got 4 service offers: vocational guidance, co-designed planning, skills and capabilities, and we're trying to then link young people to real-world opportunities, which include things like work tasters, work experience, etc. And we have a particular flow through of things that people do in trying to build aspiration and motivation and to have a line of sight to something that they really want to do. So we're working really with the personalised, individualised ambition and motivation of the young people, and then we're putting them in front of people who might further inspire them. So there's a model of practice and there's a design of the service itself that's trying to affect that. It's entirely reliant, that model, on much more than government funding. In fact, the model can't be successful if it sees itself as being only reliant on government funding. That's a small, well, it's not small, it's a significant part of it, but what it relies on is these networks with the rest of the community. The other thing that we realised is that it's not sufficient because we're interested in resources, opportunities, networks, etc. What we really wanted to do is how can we leverage the role of local employers, small to medium-sized businesses, big businesses if possible, to be actually join with us to be part of the solution. And what we find is that we've done quite a lot of work, research work as well as program work with employers, and we know that there is a lot of goodwill and commitment actually to working around these issues. But it's not only altruism that employers want to come to the table. With things like Job Active, they're just absolutely frustrated to within an inch of their life, but the fact they've been knocked on, their doors are being knocked on by multiple service providers trying to find solutions for their young people or their older people or whatever, and it drives them spare. Moreover, many in these local communities are really struggling to get a workforce that can do the jobs that they want them to do. And so it's in their interests to play less on recruitment, etc., and to have a streamlined process for matching, in this instance, young people to the kind of work that they're doing in the local community. So we are not engaging with employers as an act of corporate social responsibility because we think it's really limited in its ambition. It's a mutual investment for mutual benefit approach. So each of the, so I was saying before that we have, maybe I'll go to the next slide actually. No, go back. So saying before that we have in our program, our transition to work, we have 11 providers representing 25% of the total providers across the country, and we formed a community of practice. We meet on a biannual basis, but in the meantime, the Brotherhood provides access to training, or provides training. We're doing a developmental evaluation, and we're doing a co-design of the service model in real time as we begin to learn from each other across the country about what works and what doesn't. And so we have this community of practice. It's a community of practice that started with the providers, but once everyone was comfortable with each other, we intentionally drew the Department of Employment into the community of practice. And it's been really valuable for them, as it has been for us, because they, as contract managers, often they can look at the data, the admin data, but what they can't get a sense of in place is, what is it? Is it a bad manager in a service that means the outcomes are poor? Is it bad practice model? Is it a labour market issue? Is it a cohort issue? And so what being part of the community of practice gives government in this instance is a lens into how things are functioning in real time. And the other thing that it does is it can give comfort, because if our data doesn't look good, they are less risk averse when things are going off the rails, which is quite interesting. So there's been moments with one of our services, the Brotherhood services, where the data was not looking good, and we had to work really hard to address the issue, but we could have a kind of dialogue with government around what that actually meant. So we have 11 agencies, including the Brotherhood. We have this community of practice which meets regularly, which is trying to share knowledge and expertise, competition. And then we have, in each of those agencies' programs, has a community investment committee. And the community investment committee, so you can see this is an example of 4 of the programs, one in the Gold Coast, ours in Broadmeadows, one in Tassie, and one in Mornington in Peninsula. And what we do is we bring together employers in an employer-led community investment committee that is aimed at looking at building employment opportunities for young people in local areas, local government areas, and sometimes extending to the region. They're chaired by an employer and they're driven by the employers, but they have local government, in some cases state government, at the table, as well as ourselves and others. If you just look at the Broadmeadows one, it's chaired by a medium-sized food manufacturer in Broadmeadows. We've had a lot to do with, who has a great passion around employment. What he can do is work with fellow employers to look at what's happening in place, and more broadly just think, well, what are some of the barriers? One in Mornington Peninsula, transport is the key barrier in Mornington Peninsula. And so they're trying to generate local solutions to that transport problem. They're also banging on the door of state government, of course, but they're trying to look at the ways that they can generate a response such that they can get a workforce to be able to occupy the jobs and opportunities that they have. So they come together, they talk about the challenges, what they've learned, what they can leverage, and they also can talk to industry groups and as well as government. So when we think about this Community Investment Committee, we think about in phases, short, medium, long term, as I said before. So in the first phase, which is really where we're at now, it's a matching phase. We're thinking about how can we use these community investment committees to maximise our capacity to match young people to the jobs that are there. And in doing that, we of course have to work with the training providers, as well as other providers to support young people to be able to engage with those jobs. So it's it's working with a range of players. In the longer term, though, we're really ambitious for these community investment committees because we think that we could use them for local planning to influence demand. And so that if we could really get a vibrant set of employers, and you see it in some local areas, the Committee for Geelong, the Committee for Greater Shepparton, etc., have really tried to come together in these sorts of forums to think about how they might bring business into a community. And so in the longer term, that's our ambition with these community investment committees in the local areas. But we want to take this national. And so we have, convened a national employer reference group. It looks like my slides somehow magically disappeared, but just to give you a sense of the architecture of this design from local to national. So we have the individual service, we have the community of practice, sharing knowledge, we have the community investment committees for each of those individual programs, and then what we wanted to do, and we've begun this process already, is we have a national employer reference group, which brings the chairs of each of those community investment committees to come together to talk about the issues, the challenges, the barriers that they have experienced in place, what they've learnt, and then they will do some of the talking to government around those sorts of issues and suggestions for what they might do, what government can do to address them. They also have a line to industry groups as well, which we think are really crucial to bring on board, and a line back to the community sector as well. So we're mobilising, or trying to mobilise those employers into the conversation and a sense of responsibility to leverage their expertise to create something for them. So in thinking about this, we're really trying to think about how can we conceive of a sort of system architecture with each of the parts, picking up some of the things that Tom was saying in particular, that might help us to shape an approach in place with young people to match them to jobs and to sustainable jobs in the future. And we think the commissioning piece is a really, really important piece of this because and we've written a lot about commissioning, and I don't really have a lot of time to go into it today, but we think that there's a real opportunity to change the way that we commission services. We've been thinking, as have you, about outcomes-based commissioning. We think that's got limits as well. But we think that what government asks for in its tenders is really important. But we also think of a commissioning model in which there's more co-design, co-production in an upfront sense that brings multiple people to the table in advance of the actual contracting process, etc. So we think that it needs to embed an efficacious model so the commissioning process actually can be quite directive. So in the transition to work, one of the things that we suggested to the Department of Employment that we thought was absolutely crucial is that they should only contract not-for-profits who had demonstrated commitments, real commitments to employers, not just MOUs that looked like commitments, real commitments. So those people had to those organisations had to really demonstrate that they'd actually had some concrete relationships and wins. I think there's some other enabling conditions for this kind of work, clearly, and no time to talk about today, but industry policy, regional policy needs to join up into this conversation, as well as the work around the commissioning of employment programs at the state level as well. It seems, we provide state and federal employment, we funded for state and federal level employment programs in Broadmeadows, and I think that greater conversation is needed between these sorts of programs between governments. We think the community capacity building piece has been really overlooked, and you saw the kind of thing on capabilities that I was talking about. That actually needs resourcing, and that's not really necessarily always about money. It's about thinking about how you join different parts of civil society into the solution. And as I say, our experience is that people want to be part of a solution when they're invited into a dynamic process which is hopeful and aspirational and motivating. And finally, I want to say something, and then I'm absolutely done, around a learning and evaluation strategy, because, as I said at the beginning, big data is part of the story. It certainly gives us a very nuanced way of understanding the key elements of the problem and also the impact of particular high-level policy interventions. But without accompanying sort of thick data about what's working and how and why in real time, we're going to miss the opportunity to develop efficacious models. So I would like to join up that conversation between big data and thick data, and also make a plea for developmental kind of evaluations, for real-time evaluations, because I think government, not-for-profits, business, civil society, but most importantly, young people themselves will get a better deal from us.